The apartment wasn't much, but it was all mine. A fifth-floor walk-up in a pre-war building with questionable plumbing and a radiator that hissed like a cornered snake. But it had good light, high ceilings, and most importantly, it was rent-stabilized. In a city like New York, that wasn't just a good deal. It was a unicorn, a winning lottery ticket, a relic from a bygone era that landlords and developers were systematically trying to hunt to extinction. I had inherited the lease from my grandmother, a tough-as-nails woman who had lived in that apartment for 60 years. She had seen the neighborhood transform from a working-class enclave of immigrants to a hyper-gentrified playground for tech bros and hedge fund managers. Her lease, with its ancient grandfathered-in rent, was a fortress of affordability in a sea of obscene luxury. And when she passed away, that fortress became mine. I was a PhD student in architectural history at Columbia, which is a fancy way of saying I was professionally broke. This apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was the only reason I could afford to stay in the city and finish my dissertation. It was my anchor, my sanctuary, my inheritance. And to my new landlord, a man named Marcus Thorne, it was an intolerable anomaly on his balance sheet. Thorne wasn't your typical landlord. He wasn't some paunchy cigar-chomping guy with a ring of keys. He was a creature of the new New York, a private equity ghoul who had bought up dozens of old buildings like mine through a faceless LLC called Urban Prime Properties. He was always impeccably dressed in slim-fit suits that probably cost more than my annual tuition. His hair perfectly coiffed, his face a smooth, handsome mask of predatory capitalism. He never raised his voice. He was always disarmingly polite, but his eyes, they were like a shark's eyes, cold, empty, and constantly calculating. He saw my apartment not as a home, but as a bug in his code, a stubbornly unprofitable asset that was costing him, by his estimation, about $100,000 a year in potential market rate rent. From the day his company took over the building, he began a quiet, systematic campaign to get me out. It started with buyout offers. First, $5,000 cash to terminate the lease. I politely declined. Then $10,000, then $20,000. I always gave the same polite, firm no. The money was tempting, but it was a short-term solution. It would be gone in a year, and I would be priced out of the city forever. This apartment was my future. When the carrot didn't work, he switched to the stick. A subtle, insidious campaign of manufactured misery. The heat would mysteriously break on the coldest days of winter. The water would be shut off for emergency repairs that lasted for days at a time. My packages started to go missing from the lobby. It was a war of attrition. He was trying to make my life so uncomfortable that I would finally give up and take his money. But I was my grandmother's grandson. I was stubborn. I documented everything. I bought a space heater. I showered at the university gym. I had my packages delivered to a friend's house. I refused to be broken. The final escalation, the one that set this whole story in motion, was an act of such breathtaking pettiness that it was almost artistic in its cruelty. My grandmother had been an avid gardener. The one luxury the apartment afforded was a tiny 6-by-4-foot iron balcony off the fire escape. For 60 years, she had cultivated a magnificent jungle of potted plants out there. Ivy, geraniums, a stubborn little rose bush that bloomed every spring. It was her sanctuary. After she passed, I took over the care of her plants. It was my way of keeping her memory alive. That little balcony garden was the one splash of life and color on the otherwise grim facade of the building. The notice slipped under my door. It was from Thorne's management company. It cited a violation of a newly invented building rule. No personal items, including planters, may be stored on balconies or fire escapes. It claimed the plants were a fire hazard and a risk to pedestrian safety below. It was a lie. The balcony was a separate structure from the fire escape, and the pots were all secured in heavy wrought iron holders that were bolted to the railing. They were safer than the building's crumbling windowsills. The notice gave me 24 hours to remove all of my grandmother's plants. If I failed to comply, the management would dispose of the items and bill me for the labor. This was different from the other harassments. This wasn't about my comfort. This was about my grandmother's legacy. It was a direct personal attack on the one thing I held most sacred. I knew this was the hill I had to die on. I wrote a formal letter back to Thorne explaining the situation, pointing out that the balcony was not part of the fire escape and that the plants had been there for 60 years without a single incident. I even offered to purchase a special liability insurance rider to cover any hypothetical, infinitesimal risk. His response came the next morning, not in a letter, but in person. Two of his building's maintenance workers, Men I knew and had always been friendly with showed up at my door. They looked deeply uncomfortable. "Sorry, kid," one of them mumbled, not meeting my eye. "Mr. Thorne's orders. We gotta clear the balcony." I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding. I pleaded with them. I told them about my grandmother. They sympathized, but their jobs were on the line. Thorne was on the phone with the building superintendent, listening in. They had no choice. I stood there helpless and watched as they dismantled my grandmother's 60-year-old garden. They tossed the ivy, the geraniums, the beautiful blooming rosebush into a large black trash bag. They treated it like garbage. They were just following orders, but the cruelty of the act was staggering. It was a power move, a demonstration. Thorne was showing me that he could reach into the most personal, most sacred part of my life and destroy it, just because he could. As they were leaving, one of the workers, a kind older man named Sal, paused. He pressed a small dirt-covered object into my hand. "He told us to throw it all out," Sal whispered, his eyes full of pity. "But I saved this for you. It's from the rosebush." It was a cutting, a small green stem with a few leaves and a single unopened bud. A tiny, resilient piece of my grandmother's legacy. I stood in my empty apartment, the little cutting in my hand, and I felt a cold, calm clarity wash over me. The grief and the anger had coalesced into something hard and sharp. Marcus Thorne thought he had won. He thought he had finally broken me. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. My dissertation, the academic project that had consumed the last 5 years of my life, was on the history of New York City property law, specifically the arcane and labyrinthine world of 19th century air rights and development covenants. I was, by a strange twist of fate, one of the world's foremost experts on the legal history of the very ground beneath Thorne's feet. He had built his empire of glass and steel towers on a foundation of old, forgotten paper, and I was about to start digging. He had taken my grandmother's garden, and in return, I was going to take his entire billion-dollar portfolio, not with a lawsuit for harassment. That was a small thought. I was going to do it by resurrecting a ghost from the Gilded Age, a legal covenant that had been sleeping for over 100 years, just waiting for someone to wake it up, and I knew exactly where to find it. My academic life had been a deep dive into the dusty, forgotten corners of urban history. My dissertation was titled Verticality and Its Covenants, the Architectural DNA of the Manhattan Skyline. It was a profoundly nerdy, almost comically niche subject. I had spent years in the city's municipal archives, poring over centuries-old deeds, zoning maps, and building permits. I wasn't just a historian. I was a legal archaeologist. I knew the secret history of every block, every lot, every building in a 10-block radius of my grandmother's apartment. And I knew about the Vanderkemp Agreement. The Vanderkemp Agreement of 1898 was a piece of legal arcana so obscure that it was known only to a handful of eccentric academics like myself. It was the brainchild of a fantastically wealthy and fantastically eccentric Dutch shipping magnate named Peter Vanderkemp. Vanderkemp had owned a massive swath of land in what was now one of the most expensive real estate districts in the world. He was a passionate amateur botanist and a fierce opponent of the new towering skyscrapers that were beginning to shadow the city. He believed that sunlight was a sacred public resource and that no man had the right to build a structure that would cast his neighbor's property into perpetual darkness. When he began to sell off his land for development at the turn of the 20th century, he did something unprecedented. He wrote a restrictive covenant into every single deed. It was a complex, legally binding document, but its core provision was shockingly simple. It was a light and air covenant. It stated that no structure built on any of his former properties could ever exceed a height of 100 feet, or 10 stories. His goal was to create a permanent, low-rise, sun-drenched enclave in the heart of the rapidly growing city. But here was the genius and the poison pill of his plan. The covenant had a second clause. It stated that the height restriction would remain in effect as long as a majority of the original lots were used for residential purposes. However, if, at any point in the future, a majority of the lots were converted to commercial use, the height restriction would be lifted. But, and this was the crucial, world-breaking but, the right to develop the newly available airspace above the 100-foot limit would not belong to the current property owners. Instead, the agreement stipulated that the air rights for the entire district, a massive multi-billion-dollar column of vertical real estate, would revert to a single designated entity, the New York Botanical Garden, an institution that Vanderkemp had co-founded and adored. It was a legal time bomb, a way of ensuring that if his pastoral vision for the neighborhood was ever destroyed, the resulting financial windfall would go not to the greedy developers, but to the preservation of the nature he loved. For 100 years, the time bomb had remained dormant. The neighborhood had remained primarily residential, a mix of old tenement buildings and walk-up apartments. The 100-foot height restriction had been respected, not out of any legal necessity. Everyone had forgotten about the covenant, but simply because of the economics of the area. But in the last 20 years, everything has changed. The tech boom, the financialization of real estate, the insatiable hunger for luxury properties. And the man at the forefront of this change, the man who had bought up more of the old Vanderkemp lots than anyone else, was Marcus Thorne. Thorne's strategy was simple. He would buy an old rent-stabilized residential building like mine. He would harass and buy out the existing tenants. And then, he would convert the building to a commercial property, a boutique hotel, a high-end retail space, and a luxury office building. He had already done this with a dozen properties in the neighborhood. And his crown jewel, the project that was going to make him a billionaire, was a massive 50-story, glass and steel skyscraper he was planning to build on a full block of consolidated lots he had spent the last decade acquiring. The foundation was already being laid. It was the talk of the real estate world, and it was being built directly on the land governed by the Vanderkemp Agreement. My heart was hammering in my chest. I logged into the university's digital archive of city records, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I pulled up the deeds for every single property in the Vanderkemp district. I spent the next 48 hours, fueled by coffee and a cold, righteous fury, creating a spreadsheet. I tracked the ownership history of every lot, the building permits, the certificates of occupancy. I was mapping the genetic code of the neighborhood, and I was looking for a specific mutation. Thorne, in his relentless quest to convert residential properties to commercial ones, had been steadily chipping away at the foundation of the Vanderkemp Agreement. He thought he was just flipping buildings. He had no idea he was slowly, methodically arming a 100-year-old time bomb. The tipping point, the legal threshold, was 50%. The moment that more than half of the Vanderkemp lots were officially zoned for commercial use, the covenant would trigger, the height restriction would vanish, and the air rights, the right to build above 100 feet on every single lot in the district, would snap like a rubber band into the possession of the New York Botanical Garden. According to my calculations, Thorne's activities had brought the commercial use percentage to 48%. He was dangerously, suicidally close. He was playing with a fire he didn't even know existed. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle was my own building. It was one of the last remaining residential holdouts on its block. Thorne's plan, I knew, was to eventually empty it and convert it. That was why he was so desperate to get me out. My little rent-stabilized apartment was the final firewall. But I didn't want to just stop him. I didn't want to just save my apartment. I wanted to bring his entire empire crashing down. I wanted to trigger the covenant myself. I wanted to watch the bomb go off in his hands. And to do that, I needed to find a way to push the commercial percentage over the 50% threshold. I needed to find a residential property in the district that I could somehow get converted to commercial use. And that's when I remembered the old abandoned laundromat on the corner of my block. It was a single-story building, a relic from another era. It had been closed for years, a sad, forgotten space covered in graffiti. It was owned by an elderly couple who had retired to Florida. And most importantly, it was zoned as a mixed-use property, with the laundromat on the ground floor and a small, legally designated residential apartment on the second floor, which had been vacant for a decade. It was legally a residential lot. If I could get that apartment delisted as a residential unit, if I could get the entire property reclassified as exclusively commercial, that single tiny change would be enough. It would be the tipping point. It would push the district to 51% commercial. It would trigger the Vanderkemp Agreement. This was no longer a personal dispute. This was a multi-billion-dollar legal heist. It would require a level of sophistication and resources far beyond what a broke graduate student could muster. I needed a partner. I needed a shark of my own. I put on my only decent suit, printed out a 20-page summary of my research, complete with deeds, maps, and financial projections, and I made an appointment. I didn't go to a tenants' rights lawyer. I went to the biggest, most powerful real estate law firm in the city, the kind of firm that usually represented developers like Marcus Thorne. I got a meeting with their senior partner, a legendary litigator named Benjamin Carter. Carter was in his 70s, a lion in winter. He had a reputation for being brilliant, ruthless, and in his old age, deeply, deeply bored. He was looking for one last great, spectacular fight. I walked into his cavernous corner office overlooking Central Park. He listened to my story without interruption, his face an unreadable mask. I laid out the history, the covenant, and the financial analysis. I showed him that the air rights for the Vanderkemp district, if unlocked, were worth, by a conservative estimate, between $2 and $3 billion, and they all belonged legally to a botanical garden that had no idea it was sitting on one of the largest real estate jackpots in modern history. When I was finished, Carter leaned back in his leather chair and was silent for a full minute. I thought I had failed. I thought he was going to laugh me out of his office. Instead, he leaned forward, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Davies," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "This is the most beautiful, most diabolical, most exquisitely perfect piece of legal maneuvering I've ever seen in my 50 years of practicing law." He stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the city below. "A man of Marcus Thorne's prodigious ambition," he said, choosing his words carefully, "makes a great many enemies. I happen to know that the board of the New York Botanical Garden would be absolutely delighted to find themselves in a position to cause him a significant amount of financial distress." He turned back to me, his eyes alight with the thrill of the hunt. "So, here's what we're going to do. My firm will represent the Botanical Garden, pro bono. We will handle all the legal costs. Your job is to get us that laundromat, secure the tipping point, and when you do, we will unleash a legal firestorm that will make Marcus Thorne wish he had never been born." He extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" I shook it. I had my shark, and now, the hunt for Marcus Thorne was about to begin in earnest. The laundromat became my obsession, the unassuming linchpin of a multi-billion-dollar corporate assassination. My first step was to find the owners, a retired couple in Florida. I did a public records search and found their address, a small condo in a retirement community near Sarasota. I didn't want to just call them. A cold call about a derelict property they hadn't thought about in a decade would be suspicious. I needed a pretense, a plausible reason for my interest. My dissertation, my shield of academic nerdiness, was the perfect cover. I booked a cheap flight to Florida. I showed up at their door not as a legal operative, but as a humble, earnest graduate student. I told them I was writing a paper on the history of small family-owned businesses in their old neighborhood, and that their laundromat was one of the last remaining examples. I was polite, I was charming, and I was completely full of crap. They were delighted. They were a sweet elderly couple, nostalgic for their old life in the city. They invited me in for iced tea and spent 2 hours telling me stories about the neighborhood in the 70s. After gaining their trust, I gently broached the subject of the property itself. I asked them about the vacant apartment upstairs. "Oh, that old place," the husband Manny said with a wave of his hand. "Hasn't fit for man nor beast in 20 years. The plumbing's shot, the roof leaks. We just boarded it up." This was my opening. "You know," I said, trying to sound as helpful and off the cuff as possible, "I was just looking at the city's property tax records for my research. It looks like you're still paying the full residential property tax rate on that unit, even though it's uninhabitable." They looked at me confused. They were not sophisticated business people. They just paid the bills that came in the mail. "There's a simple form you can file with the Department of Buildings," I explained. "A certificate of non-occupancy. If a residential unit is legally certified as uninhabitable, you're no longer liable for the residential tax assessment. It would save you a few $1,000s a year." I had the form with me, of course. I had downloaded it from the city's website and filled out all the technical details myself. All it needed was their signature. They were overjoyed. They saw me as a kind, helpful young man who had just saved them a significant amount of money. They signed the form without a moment's hesitation, thanking me profusely. They had no idea that the document they had just signed was the legal trigger for a $3 billion corporate detonation. With the signed form in hand, the next step was to get it filed and approved by the New York City Department of Buildings, a notoriously slow and inefficient bureaucracy. This was where my new partnership with Benjamin Carter's law firm became indispensable. Carter assigned me a paralegal, a sharp, incredibly well-connected woman named Maria, who knew every clerk, every administrator, every shortcut in the Byzantine labyrinth of city government. What would have taken me 6 months to accomplish on my own, she managed in 2 weeks. She hand-walked the form through the system, getting the necessary inspections expedited and the final certification pushed through. The official status of the laundromat property was changed in the city's database. The residential unit on the second floor legally ceased to exist. And with that single quiet bureaucratic keystroke, the Vanderkemp Agreement was triggered. The commercial use of the district had officially tipped to 51%. The 100-foot height restriction was now, legally, null and void, and the air rights, the invisible columns of priceless real estate stretching up to the heavens, had silently, instantly transferred from the hands of 100 different property owners into the sole possession of the New York Botanical Garden. No one knew it yet. The bomb was armed, the countdown had reached 0. All that was left to do was to push the button. The announcement was coordinated with the precision of a military operation. The New York Botanical Garden, represented by Benjamin Carter, filed a massive lawsuit in New York Supreme Court. The primary defendant was Marcus Thorne's Urban Prime Properties, but the suit also named every other property owner in the Vanderkemp district. The lawsuit did not ask for money. It asked for a declaratory judgment, a court order officially affirming the Botanical Garden's ownership of all air rights in the district, as per the 1898 Vanderkemp Agreement. Simultaneously, Carter held a press conference. It was a bombshell. The story was on the front page of every major newspaper the next morning. "Gilded Age Covenant gives Botanical Garden billions in air rights," screamed the headline in the Wall Street Journal. The real estate world was thrown into an absolute panic. Marcus Thorne's 50-story skyscraper, his billion-dollar crown jewel, was the primary victim. He had the right to build on his land, of course, but only up to 100 feet. Anything higher than the 10th floor now legally belonged to the Botanical Garden. His project was instantly, catastrophically worthless. But it was worse than that. He had pre-sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of luxury condos and commercial leases in the upper floors of his planned tower. Those contracts were now null and void. He was facing an avalanche of lawsuits from his own investors and buyers. He was financially ruined, not by a market crash, but by the ghost of a Dutch botanist and a broke graduate student he had tried to evict. The legal battle was brief and brutal. Carter's case was legally unassailable. The covenant was a recorded deed restriction, and its language was unambiguous. Thorne's lawyers tried to argue that the covenant was an anachronistic relic, that it was unenforceable. They lost. The court's ruling was a swift and decisive victory for the Botanical Garden. They were now officially the owners of one of the most valuable pieces of undeveloped real estate in the world. Thorne's reaction was a spectacle of corporate implosion. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control, and he had been undone by a force he couldn't bully, a rule he couldn't bend. He was forced to halt construction on his skyscraper, leaving a 10-story concrete and steel skeleton looming over the neighborhood like a monument to his own hubris. His investors pulled out. His lines of credit were frozen. Urban Prime Properties, once a titan of the industry, was forced to declare bankruptcy. Thorne, who had been on the verge of becoming a billionaire, was now facing a mountain of debt and a tsunami of litigation that would consume the rest of his life. And what of the Botanical Garden? The new, accidental real estate moguls. They were a non-profit scientific and cultural institution. They had no interest in building luxury towers. Instead, they did something both brilliant and deeply in keeping with the spirit of Peter Vanderkemp. They announced that they would be auctioning off the air rights in sections over the next decade, and all of the proceeds, every single $1 billion, would be placed into a new endowment to fund botanical research, global conservation efforts, and free educational programs for city school children in perpetuity. The greatest act of Gilded Age greed was transformed into one of the largest single acts of public philanthropy in the city's history. Marcus Thorne, in his petty, cruel attempt to destroy my grandmother's tiny balcony garden, had inadvertently funded the preservation of countless acres of rainforest and the education of a generation of young botanists. The irony was so perfect, so profound, it was almost a work of art. My own victory was a quiet, personal one. A few weeks after the court's ruling, a large ornate envelope was delivered to my apartment. It was from the Board of Trustees of the New York Botanical Garden. Inside was a simple handwritten note from the board's chair. It read, "Dear Mr. Davies, words cannot express our gratitude. You have secured the future of this institution and have created a legacy of conservation that will last for centuries. Enclosed is a small token of our appreciation." The token was a single golden key. The letter explained that it was a lifetime membership to the Botanical Garden, granting me and my guests unlimited, private, after-hours access to their grounds and greenhouses. It was the key to my own personal Eden, but there was a second item in the envelope. It was a deed. They had used a small portion of their newfound wealth to buy my building from the bankruptcy court. The deed transferred ownership of my apartment, Unit 5B, from the now-defunct Urban Prime Properties to me. They had given me my home. The fortress my grandmother had built was now legally and permanently mine. I would never have to pay rent again. The letter concluded with a final perfect postscript. We have also taken the liberty of reinstalling your grandmother's balcony planters. We hope the roses bloom for you this spring. I walked to my balcony and there it was. The wrought iron holders, the fresh soil, the ivy, the geraniums, and in the center, in a beautiful new terracotta pot, was a thriving, healthy rose bush, its buds just beginning to open in the morning sun. Thorne's petty revenge had been answered, and my own was complete. The aftermath of the Vanderkemp detonation was, for me, a period of profound and surreal adjustment. I had gone from being a broke graduate student on the verge of eviction to a homeowner with a golden key to a private paradise, all in the span of a few months. The city, which had once felt like an insurmountable financial obstacle, was now my own. I finished my dissertation, the final chapters now imbued with a sense of personal, visceral experience that no amount of archival research could have ever provided. I had not just studied the history of property law, I had made it. My story, though never explicitly public, became a quiet, whispered legend in the halls of Columbia's history department. I was the student who had taken his research out of the library and used it to topple a titan. The irony, of course, was that the greatest act of revenge in modern New York real estate history had been, at its core, an act of historical preservation. I hadn't created anything new. I had simply resurrected something old. I had reminded a city that had forgotten its own history that the past is never truly dead. It's just sleeping, waiting in the dusty archives for someone to come along and wake it up. My life settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. I accepted a teaching position at the university, my newfound financial security allowing me the freedom to pursue a quiet, academic life. The apartment, my grandmother's fortress, was now truly my sanctuary. I tended to her garden, the roses blooming more vibrantly each year, a living testament to the victory. I spent many evenings at the Botanical Garden, using my golden key to wander through the empty greenhouses after the crowds had gone home, the air thick with the scent of orchids and damp earth. It was a peace I had never thought possible, but the ghost of Marcus Thorne and the spectacular implosion of his empire was a story that was not yet fully told. The bankruptcy of urban prime properties was one of the most complex and brutal in the city's history. Thorne had built his company on a mountain of debt and a web of interconnected shell corporations. The process of untangling it all was a feeding frenzy for lawyers and creditors. He had not just lost his future, he had lost his past. Every asset he had ever acquired was now being clawed back, every transaction scrutinized. He was a man being erased, piece by piece, by the very financial system he had once sought to master. About a year after the court's ruling, I was contacted by a lawyer from the firm that was handling the bankruptcy proceedings. They were in the process of liquidating every asset of Thorne's empire, and they had come across a strange and troubling anomaly. Thorne, it turned out, had a secret, a very big, very old secret. In the early days of his career, long before he was a real estate mogul, he had used a shell corporation to quietly purchase a single, seemingly insignificant property. It was a small 5-story tenement building on the Lower East Side, a neighborhood that, at the time, was still a gritty, working-class enclave. The building was in a state of extreme disrepair, and it was fully occupied by rent-stabilized tenants, mostly elderly immigrants and working-class families. On paper, it was a terrible investment, a money pit, but Thorne had held onto it for 30 years. He had never tried to sell it, never tried to develop it. He had just let it sit there rotting while he built his billion-dollar empire around it. The bankruptcy lawyers couldn't understand it. It didn't fit his profile. It was a financially irrational asset. They had dug into the building's history, and they had found a thick file of tenant complaints, building code violations, and lawsuits. The building was a slum, a testament to decades of neglect. And they had found something else. The name of the lawyer who had represented the tenants in their decades-long, largely unsuccessful fight against Thorne's neglectful ownership was a woman named Elizabeth Davies, my mother. The phone call felt like a punch to the gut. My mother, who had passed away when I was in college, had been a tenants' rights lawyer, a fiery, passionate advocate for the underdog. It was her work that had inspired my own interest in the history of the city's buildings and the people who lived in them. But she had rarely talked about the specifics of her cases. She had wanted to shield me from the ugliness of the world she fought against. I had known she fought against slum landlords. I had just never known his name. The bankruptcy lawyer explained that the tenants, now that Thorne was financially ruined, were making one last desperate attempt to take control of their building. They were trying to form a co-op, to buy the building out of bankruptcy and manage it themselves. But they were facing a mountain of legal and financial obstacles, and they were looking for help. He had seen my mother's name in the old files, had seen my name as the heir to my grandmother's apartment, and had made the connection. He was calling not in his official capacity as the bankruptcy lawyer, but as a human being who had been moved by the tenants' plight. He was asking if I would be willing to meet with them. I walked to the address on the Lower East Side that afternoon, my mind reeling. The building was even worse than I had imagined. The facade was crumbling, the windows were grimy, the entryway smelled of damp and decay. It was a world away from the gleaming towers of Thorne's ambition. I was met in the lobby by a group of the remaining tenants. They were old, tired, but their eyes were full of a fierce, resilient pride. They were the last of the old guard, people who had lived in this building for 50, 60 years, who had raised their families in these small, crumbling apartments. They remembered my mother. They spoke of her with a reverence that brought tears to my eyes. She had been their champion, their warrior. She had fought for them for years, winning them small victories, a new boiler here, a repaired roof there, but she had never been able to defeat the true enemy, Thorne's deliberate, calculated neglect. His strategy had been to let the building rot, to let the tenants die out or give up until he was the last man standing. This building, I realized, was not a financial investment for him. It was a personal vendetta. This was his origin story. This was the first building he had ever bought, and the tenants' defiance, their refusal to be broken, had been his first great failure. His entire career, his entire empire had been a monument built on the foundation of his hatred for these people, for their stubborn, inconvenient humanity. And that's when I understood the true, cosmic shape of the story. My fight with Thorne hadn't started with a balcony garden. It started 30 years ago in this very building with my mother. I was not the beginning of this story. It was the end. I was the second act of a generational struggle. My mother had fought him on the ground, in the trenches of the housing court. I had defeated him from the sky, with the abstract, invisible power of air rights. We were a team, separated by time, but united by a single unwavering purpose. The tenants needed help. They needed money to buy the building, and they needed expertise to manage it. And I, thanks to the strange karmic justice of the universe, now had both. I went back to Benjamin Carter. I told him the story. I told him about my mother, about the tenants, about the final missing piece of the puzzle. He listened, his old eyes full of a quiet, profound understanding. "The story," he said when I had finished, "is not yet complete." The next day, he called a special discretionary meeting of the Board of Trustees of the New York Botanical Garden. He and I went together. We stood before the board, a collection of some of the city's most powerful and philanthropic individuals, and we told them the whole story. The story of the Gilded Age botanist, of the petty tyrant, of the balcony garden, of the slum building, of the mother and son who had, across a span of 30 years, fought the same monster. We made a proposal. We asked them to use a tiny fraction of 1% of their multi-billion-dollar endowment, a rounding error on their balance sheet, to fund the creation of a new non-profit housing trust. The trust's first act would be to purchase the building on the Lower East Side, to renovate it completely, and to turn it over to the tenants as a permanent, self-governing co-op. The vote was unanimous. The trust was formed. We bought the building, and we didn't just fix the boiler. We gutted the entire structure down to the studs. We put in new plumbing, new wiring, new walls, new everything. We worked with the tenants, redesigning the apartments to be more livable, more beautiful. We turned a slum into a palace. The day we handed the keys over to the tenants' newly formed co-op board was one of the proudest days of my life. The tenants, people who had lived their entire lives under the thumb of a cruel, indifferent landlord, were now the owners of their own homes, the masters of their own destiny. They had won. My mother had won. As we were leaving the celebration in the building's newly renovated lobby, the elderly woman who was the new co-op president took my hand. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "She never gave up on us. And neither did you. You have her fire." At that moment, I finally understood the true meaning of my inheritance. It wasn't a rent-stabilized apartment. It was the fire. The stubborn, unyielding belief that a home is more than just an asset. That a community is more than just a collection of buildings. And that the fight for justice, no matter how long it takes, is always, always a fight worth having. The creation of the Housing Trust, which we named the Elizabeth Davies Housing Cooperative in honor of my mother, had an unforeseen and beautiful ripple effect. It became a new model for urban preservation. The story of the tenant's victory, funded by the unlikely proceeds of a Gilded Age air rights covenant, was a powerful and inspiring narrative. It attracted the attention of other philanthropic organizations, city pension funds, and socially conscious investors. The trust, which had started with a single decrepit building, began to grow. We started acquiring other neglected rent-stabilized buildings, properties that were being warehoused by predatory landlords like Thorne, and converting them into tenant-owned co-ops. We became a force for preservation, a bulwark against the relentless tide of gentrification that was washing away the city's history and its soul. I took a seat on the trust's board, my role as a quiet academic now permanently intertwined with a new life as a housing advocate. My dissertation on the history of property law was no longer just a historical document. It was a playbook. I used my arcane knowledge of the city's legal DNA to find other forgotten covenants, other legal loopholes, other ways to protect the city's most vulnerable residents. It was the most meaningful work of my life, a perfect synthesis of my academic passion and my mother's legacy of social justice. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, had faded from the public eye. His name, once a fixture in the real estate journals and the society pages, was now mentioned only in the dry, dense language of bankruptcy filings and court dockets. He had lost everything. His company, his fortune, his reputation. He was a ghost in the city he had once sought to conquer. I had assumed that our stories, his and mine, had finally, definitively diverged. But the universe, in its intricate and often cruel sense of narrative symmetry, had one final shocking chapter in store for us. About 2 years after the formation of the Housing Trust, I was working late in my office at Columbia when I received a call from Sal, the kind, older maintenance worker from my old building, the one who had saved the cutting from my grandmother's rose bush. His voice was frantic. "Mr. Davies," he said, "you need to get down here. Something terrible has happened." "It's Mr. Thorne." My blood ran cold. I rushed out of my office and took the subway down to my old neighborhood. When I arrived, the street in front of my building was a chaotic scene of flashing lights, police cars, and emergency vehicles. A crowd of onlookers was gathered behind a police cordon. Sal met me at the tape. His face was pale. "He's up there," he said, his voice trembling as he pointed up at the roof of my building. The building that Thorne no longer owned. The building where my apartment, my home, now was. "He got past security somehow. He's on the roof. He's been threatening to jump." My mind couldn't process it. Marcus Thorne, the man who had been my invisible corporate tormentor, was now a desperate, broken man standing on the edge of a roof, 50 feet above the pavement. I was a resident, a stakeholder. The police let me through the cordon. I found the police captain in the lobby, a grim-faced woman who was coordinating the response. A negotiator was on the roof, talking to Thorne, but he was refusing to communicate. He was just standing on the ledge, staring down at the city below. "We found this in his pocket," the captain said, handing me a small folded piece of paper. It was a notice from a homeless shelter. Thorne, the man who had once owned a portfolio of luxury properties worth over $1 billion, was now homeless. The bankruptcy had taken everything. His wife had left him. His friends had abandoned him. He had nothing left. And in his final desperate act, he had returned to the scene of his greatest failure. He had returned to my building. "He keeps asking for someone," the captain said. "He won't say who, just that it's the person who lives in 5B, that's you, right?" I nodded, my throat dry. He was asking for me. He wanted an audience for his final act of despair. The captain was hesitant. It was a massive breach of protocol. But Thorne was becoming more agitated. She was running out of options. "Okay," she said, making a decision. "You're going up. But you wear this." She handed me a bulletproof vest and an earpiece so I could communicate with her and the negotiator. I walked up the 5 flights of stairs, my legs feeling like lead. The air on the roof was cold and windy. The negotiator, a calm professional man, was standing a few feet back from the ledge. And there on the edge of the roof, his back to me, was Marcus Thorne. He looked like a ghost. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a cheap threadbare coat. He was gaunt, his hair unkempt. He was a shadow of the man I had once known. "Thorne," I said, my voice steady, amplified by the wind. He turned, and his eyes, those cold, empty shark's eyes, fixed on me. But they weren't empty anymore. They were filled with a terrifying, bottomless despair. "Davies," he rasped, his voice raw. "I should have known you'd come. You always did have a flair for the dramatic. What are you doing up here, Thorne?" I asked, taking a slow step closer. "I'm admiring the view," he said with a bitter, hollow laugh. He gestured out at the glittering, vertical landscape of the city. "My city. I built this. I owned this, and you took it all away from me with a piece of paper. 100-year-old piece of paper." "You took it from yourself," I said quietly. "You were so busy building your empire, you forgot about the foundation. You forgot about the rules." "Rules?" He spat, his voice filled with venom. "The only rule is that you take what you can. You were just better at it than I was. You and your mother." My blood ran cold. "What do you know about my mother?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. He let out another rattling laugh. "Oh, I knew all about Elizabeth Davies. The saint of the Lower East Side. She was my first great opponent. 30 years she fought me in that slum building. She was a thorn in my side, a constant, irritating reminder of the one thing I couldn't conquer. I hated her. And then I found out she had a son. A brilliant, nerdy little son who was studying the history of the very land I was trying to buy. It was perfect. I started tracking you when you were still an undergraduate. I knew you would end up in your grandmother's apartment. I knew you were the key." I just stared at him, the pieces of a puzzle I had never even known existed snapping into place. "That notice," I whispered, my mind reeling. "The balcony garden. It wasn't random. You targeted me from the very beginning." "Of course I did," he said, a flicker of his old arrogant pride returning. "It was a test. I wanted to see if you had her fire. I wanted to see if the son was as stubborn as the mother. I needed to know what I was up against before I made my final move on the neighborhood. It was just business." It was the most monstrous, most psychopathic thing I had ever heard. My entire ordeal, the harassment, the cruelty, had been a calculated experiment. He had been playing a game with my life, with my family's legacy, a game that had started 30 years ago with my mother. "You know," he said, his voice dropping, a strange, almost wistful look on his face. "In another life, you and we could have been partners. You have a talent, Davies, a killer instinct. You just lack ambition." He took a step closer to the edge. "But it doesn't matter now. The game's over, and I've decided I'm not going to play anymore." The negotiator's voice crackled in my earpiece. "Keep him talking, Liam. We're moving into position." I had to do something. I had to find the right words. And in that moment, I thought of my grandmother's rose bush, of the little cutting Sal had saved for me, a symbol of resilience, of life in the face of destruction. "It's not over, Thorne," I said, my voice clear and strong. "You lost the game, but you're still here. You can still rebuild. You just have to be willing to start from the ground up." He looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "There is no ground up for me," he whispered. "There's only down." He turned and looked down at the street 100 feet below. And in that terrifying final moment, I realized what I had to do. I had to offer him the one thing he had never offered anyone else. Grace. "The housing trust," I said, the words coming to me in a rush. "The one I founded in my mother's name. We have a job training program for formerly homeless individuals. We teach construction skills, building management. We help people get back on their feet." He turned back to me, his face a mask of utter disbelief. You would offer me a job?" he stammered. "A handout?" "It's not a handout," I said. "It's a chance. A chance to build something real for a change, instead of just a monument to your own ego. A chance to honor the city instead of just trying to own it. The choice is yours, Thorne." He stood there on the precipice, the wind whipping his threadbare coat around him. He was a man balanced between two futures, a final, desperate fall, or a slow, difficult, and deeply humiliating climb back up. He looked at me, at the city, at the ground below, and then for the first time, the great Marcus Thorne, the titan of real estate, the master of the universe, began to weep. He sank to his knees, away from the edge, his body convulsing with the racking, agonizing sobs of a man who had finally, completely, and irrevocably broken. Marcus Thorne did not jump. He was quietly, professionally, taken into custody and transported to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. The incident never made the papers. The police captain, in an act of profound and unexpected decency, buried the report. Thorne's final desperate act was allowed to remain a private tragedy, not a public spectacle. He spent the next 6 months in a state-run mental health facility, a place as far removed from the opulence of his former life as it was possible to be. He was a man stripped bare, All of his ambition, his arrogance, his power burned away, leaving only the raw, damaged core of a human being. I did not visit him. I did not call. I gave him the space and the silence he needed. But my offer, the one I had made on that windy rooftop, was real. When he was released, a quiet, gaunt, and deeply humbled man, there was a message waiting for him. It was from the director of the Elizabeth Davies Housing Cooperative. It offered him a place in their entry-level job training program. No special treatment, no executive track. He would start at the bottom, sweeping floors, learning how to plaster a wall, how to fix a leaky faucet. He would be just another broken man trying to learn how to build again. He accepted. He started work at the very building on the Lower East Side that had been the genesis of our 30-year war. The building that was now a monument to my mother's legacy. He lived in a halfway house and took the subway to work every day. The other residents, the people he had once systematically tormented, did not know who he was. To them, he was just Marcus, the quiet older guy on the maintenance crew. And by all accounts, he was a model employee. He was punctual, he was diligent, he was humble. He was, for the first time in his life, doing an honest day's work. The story of Marcus Thorne, for me, ended there. His path was his own, a long, slow road toward a redemption he may or may not ever find. My own path, I realized, had also been irrevocably changed. The battle with Thorne had taught me that the systems of power, the arcane rules and forgotten histories that govern our lives, were not just a subject for academic study. They were real, they were powerful, and they could be wielded for good or for ill. I left my teaching position at Columbia. My work with the Housing Trust had become my true calling. We expanded our mission, using the billions of dollars from the Vanderkemp Endowment to become one of the largest and most effective affordable housing developers in the country. We didn't just renovate old buildings. We started building new ones. Beautiful, sustainable, and permanently affordable housing for the working-class families, the immigrants, the artists, the very people who were the lifeblood of the city. My knowledge of history, of the city's architectural DNA, became my greatest asset. We built buildings that honored the character of their neighborhoods, that provided light and air and green space. We were, in a way, fulfilling Peter Vanderkemp's original vision, not by restricting growth, but by ensuring that the growth was equitable, just, and humane. My life became a testament to a simple, powerful idea, that the most effective form of revenge is not destruction, but creation. It is to build something better in the place of what was broken, to answer cruelty with compassion, greed with generosity, and despair with a stubborn, unyielding hope. I still live in my grandmother's apartment. It is my anchor, my touchstone, the place where the story began and where it will eventually end. The balcony garden is my daily meditation, a reminder of the small, beautiful things that are worth fighting for. The golden key to the botanical garden still hangs by my door, a symbol of the strange, magical journey that had started with a single, brutal act of pettiness. And sometimes, on a clear, quiet night, I walk down to the Lower East Side. I stand across the street from the building that my mother fought for, the building that now bears her name. I see the lights on in the windows. I hear the faint sounds of life and laughter from within, and I see the building's new maintenance supervisor, a quiet, older man named Marcus, methodically sweeping the front steps, his work illuminated by the warm, welcoming glow of the lobby light. He never looks up. He never sees me. We are two ghosts in the long, complex, and beautiful history of the city, our stories forever intertwined, our war finally, mercifully, over. And the roses, on my balcony and in the small, newly planted garden in front of his building, continue to bloom.